latest Transatlantic Trends report was very, very interesting because, besides for the first time focusing on Poland, which Ambassador knows well, the Polish reaction to NATO, it said, it made the point that the US can actually deal with China. It made the point that, yes, as a partner in interdependency, the US would have no problems working with China. And when the same question was asked of the Europeans said, no, we feel we won't be able to get on with China, we're too different. And this brings, it's very interesting, this part of the section of the Transatlantic Trends. And I bring this up because it is about interdependency. Can you transcend different political cultures in order to find some common ground? I just throw out this thought to you, Fabrice, if you want to say something else, please.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you to Demos and Atlantic Council in this beautiful city. I won't say the name, because yesterday I was told I don't know how to say it properly, but still a very nice place indeed. Let me just go at the core of the matter. I think the debate of the Western decline is self-defeatist, and it's not entirely based on accurate facts. I think the real question is not so much whether we decline or upcline or whatever we do, but it's whether we can be a regressive power or whether we are going to be a progressive power, whether we are going to be reactive and try to maintain the status quo, i.e. the European voting share at the IMF, or whether we are going to be proactive and be ready to transform ourselves in order also to transform our new partners. And I take again the example of Turkey, which I think is telling. Turkey, over the last 10 years or more, has really become a new player. And in a way, Europe and the United States also have missed that episode. And so we need to readjust our vision of Turkey. It's not anymore a Cold War type of relationship. It's a post-Cold War Turkey that wants to be an active, independent regional player, and we have to start like this. So I think the key question facing the transatlantic relation is whether we can have our shared values to deliver added value. It's not enough to have shared values. You need to be able to translate them in concrete elements. I have three for you. One is on the security front. There's a lot of talk about defense cuts because of the economic crisis. This is a fact, and we need to manage that. But I think the economic crisis should not become a crisis of commitment. And this is down to political decisions. This is not only down to the treasuries that are telling their Ministry of Defense to cut the budgets. And here I think the North Atlantic Alliance can think in terms of smart cuts, in terms of protecting those very areas in the defense structure, such as human intelligence, technological intelligence. France does not have a drone technology, for example. Instead of having Leclerc tank, we could have drones. That would be much more useful for 21st century type conflict. So I think it's here about thinking about smart cuts rather than thinking about heavy cuts that can damage the alliance as a whole. Then the second area is about values. It's quite interesting that none of the panelists mentioned the value thing, because this is what we're about. Okay, we had one. Good. The Lisbon Treaty, Article 3, states that Europe is about democratic values both inside Europe and promoting those values outside. What are we going to do about that? The enlargement engine is not broken, but is stalled. And the US is kind of recovering from two successive Bush administrations that have, I would say, made the notion of democracy promotion more complicated or more toxic. But yet, we have to find a formula to bring about to the rest, outside the West, the notion of democratic values without imposing a model. And I think here there is a lot of work to be done in that area. And finally, my third point is climate change. Climate change was the kind of highest point of hope between the US and Europe when Obama was elected, and is probably the biggest disappointment, both vis-a-vis the transatlantic partnership, but also inside Europe. Europe lost its illusions in Copenhagen. Europe was isolated. Its notion that because it it was right on climate, it was going to prevail, was defeated by the reality of new geopolitics. Here, I think the key is not for Europe and the US to look at yet another Doha-type round that is going to last for another 10 years before we produce a watered-down global deal. It's about looking for bottom-up partnership. States like California are at the vanguard of emission control, and in Europe we can do more. And I will finish, the transportation sector in the US is one of the highest emitter of carbon emissions. Yet the European transportation sector is one of the most modernized one and one of the most advanced one. If we collaborate, we could save, according to a World Bank report, in the US, the equivalent of what the developing world might produce in terms of carbon emission in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Well, I would love to agree with you on the European transport system. They can't even agree on a proper trans-European railway network which would reduce the carbon emissions. But it's interesting what you say. I want to take up on the values issue, and then I want to get the hands up, please. Per capita, I mean, if you look at the EU budget and what it does for the development aid budget and the foreign budgets, they don't go to civil society building from the bottom up. The US budgets do this. And that's very interesting. If you look at all in North Africa, in the Ukraine, in Moldova, the budgets that the US do for civil society building from the bottom up is much higher than the EU budget, which always tends to give money to the states or to the state structures and governments, and then we know what happens. So I'm just looking for the rush of hands, because this is meant to be participatory and interdependency and inclusive.
Can I
yes,
two finger on what you've just...
Please.
It's interesting you say that, because I think for many people it's actually the opposite. The US is often very political about the way it promotes political reform and democracy, whilst the EU is often criticized for being far too technical and what we call developmental. That means bottom-up. And I think, in a way, you need both. But what you need is the US and Europe to kind of come closer to how they're going to articulate their different approaches to how to promote more open societies.
Well, we had this discussion yesterday on the values and democracy panel, which was very, very interesting. But one thing we didn't have the time for on this panel was conditionality. I mean, if you talk about values, and if you talk about building society, building civil society from the bottom up, or in fact giving aid to state institutions to help them build up the judiciary, do you bring in conditionality as an arm of extending your values? I'll just throw this question out, and I'm particularly thinking of the case of Ukraine now, what's happening with the new government there. So, unless anybody
if
wants...
I may
yes,
say
please.
a word about this, I think that conditionality is a wonderful tool. If you look at the case, the biggest achievement of the European Union, the enlargement in several rounds, the last one to embrace the new member states in Central and Eastern Europe. It was all based on homework and conditionality. And this is one message that I believe has to go down, has to be understood in countries like Ukraine and other countries that think seriously or may think seriously in the future about joining the European Union. And I believe conditionality is a very powerful tool. And in fact, when we look at what can be done, how we can improve, for example, Eastern Partnership, I believe we have to strengthen conditionality. We have to relate better what are our political objectives vis-à-vis those countries, what is the rate of progress in their reforms, and what are their ambitions vis-à-vis relationship with the European Union. And we have to be very serious about conditionality.
Yeah, absolutely. Ambassador, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, well, first of all, just a lot of this depends on how you do your bookkeeping, and of course, a lot of the assistance that flows and development assistance and aid, a lot of it comes from governments, but a lot of it also comes from the non-governmental sector. A lot of the government money goes to the non-governmental sector and gets fed in. So, the Gates Foundation, for example, is extremely active in Poland in providing money to regional libraries. It's a $1 billion program. It's quite significant, and this is the kind of thing that doesn't always get factored into both the dollars and the approach that U.S. sourced assistance provides. But for the record, let me just give you a little bit more detail on this, because I did some homework before I got here. So With respect to the Eastern Partnership, and we're very enthusiastic about the EU's Eastern Partnership. We'd really like to see it get moving. We know that there's a little bit of money that's being spent perhaps on Moldova, and we welcome that. But in 2010, U.S. assistance to the 6 Eastern Partnership countries totaled $311 million, and that focused actually on bottom-up stuff, democratic actors in civil society, and building good governance. And then, that doesn't include Georgia, and Georgia, where obviously key effort of international efforts. There was $400 million last year, and there'll be something along the same lines next year for a total of $1 billion over 2 years. I just also wanted to go back to one other point about the United States and its interest or lack of interest in Central Europe and Poland. And I guess the way I would put this is as follows. The United States really thinks that a strong EU would be to America's benefit. And the United States also believes that a strong Poland and a strong EU would be to America's benefit. We, all of us, people, our friends, worked very hard for Poland and Central Europe's full integration into transatlantic and European institutions. And so with Poland, we feel like we can be proud that Poland is a major player in the EU. And so affinity for the EU is not something we see as coming at the expense of affinity for the United States. In fact, we see these things very much as mutually reinforcing. And I agree with what President Komorowski has said about this, which is asking Poland to choose between NATO and the EU is like asking us to choose between mommy and daddy. He didn't say which was which, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ambassador.